that gets passed around film forums every few years. It shows two actors on a French estate, in period costume, standing just a little too close, looking at each other with an intensity that has nothing to do with the camera in front of them. The photo is from the set of a 1988 movie about seduction and ruin. And for almost 4 decades, that photo has carried a rumor with it, a rumor that neither of the two people in it would ever confirm. Until, very recently, one of them finally said something. Not a confession, exactly. Something quieter, stranger, and in some ways more revealing than a confession would have been. Let's go back to the beginning, because the story only makes sense once you understand what these two people actually risked by getting close to each other. The year is 1988. The movie is Dangerous Liaisons, adapted from an 18th-century French novel about aristocrats who treat seduction as a blood sport. That source material, Les Liaisons Dangereuses, had already been scandalizing readers for 2 centuries before Hollywood ever touched it, a book considered so cynical about love and manipulation that it raised eyebrows when it was first published in pre-revolutionary France. By the time it reached the screen, it had also been adapted as a stage play, which is where much of the creative energy behind the film version actually originated. The director is Stephen Frears, and the cast is stacked. Glenn Close playing a woman who manipulates everyone around her for sport, John Malkovich as a calculating libertine, and Michelle Pfeiffer as the virtuous, married woman he sets out to destroy. The film would go on to earn 7 Oscar nominations and cement itself as one of the great erotic dramas of its decade. It's the kind of production that still gets studied in film schools for how much tension it manages to generate from characters who mostly just talk to each other in drawing rooms. There's barely any violence in it, barely any action in the conventional sense. Just conversation, manipulation, and the slow unraveling of people who believe they're in control of their own feelings. That's exactly why the off-screen story that eventually attached itself to the production landed with so much irony. A movie about people who convince themselves they can toy with desire without consequence ended up, according to nearly everyone connected to it, doing precisely that to its own stars. At the time, Pfeiffer was already one of the biggest names in Hollywood, coming off Scarface and The Witches of Eastwick, about to enter the run of films, The Fabulous Baker Boys, Batman Returns, that would turn her into an icon. She was married to television writer and producer Peter Horton, a relationship that had started years earlier when the two met in an acting class and that, by most accounts, was steady and unremarkable in the best sense of that word. Malkovich, meanwhile, had built a reputation as one of the most serious actors of his generation, having come up through Chicago's Steppenwolf Theater Company and earned an Oscar nomination for Places in the Heart. He was married to actress Glenn Headley, someone he'd met through that same Steppenwolf ensemble, a relationship rooted as much in shared artistic history as in romance. Both of them, in other words, had something real to protect. And according to people who were actually there, they didn't protect it. The person who eventually said the quiet part out loud wasn't Pfeiffer or Malkovich, it was their director. In a 2003 profile for the New York Times, Stephen Frears discussed how the emotional world of the film had bled into the actors' real lives. He described Malkovich's marriage as falling apart during production, and characterized what was happening between Malkovich and Pfeiffer as an affair. Frears connected it directly to the material itself, framing the whole situation as a case of life imitating art almost too precisely to be comfortable. That's a director speaking on the record, not a tabloid insider or an anonymous source. It's about as close to confirmation as this story had gotten for years, except that it came from a third party, not from either of the two people actually involved. It's worth pausing on why a director would even bring this up, years after the fact, in an interview that had nothing to do with promoting the film. Frears wasn't gossiping for the sake of it. He was trying to explain something about Malkovich as an artist and as a person, the way the emotional demands of that particular role seemed to spill over into his actual life, and how disorienting that experience apparently was for him. Frears' description wasn't cruel or salacious in tone. If anything, it read as sympathetic, an attempt to make sense of how a fictional story about betrayal had somehow reached out and rewritten the real lives of the people telling it. That's a very different thing from a tabloid running an anonymous, insider quote, and it's part of why this particular account has held up as credible for over 20 years now, repeated and cited by outlet after outlet without ever being challenged or walked back. The timing lines up in a way that's hard to write off as coincidence. Both marriages ended in 1988, the same year the film hit theaters. Pfeiffer and Horton split, reportedly on relatively amicable terms. There are accounts of her saying the breakup wasn't bitter, that he even helped her pack up her belongings. Malkovich and Headley's split was, by most reporting, considerably rockier. Headley is said to have been furious, and the fallout from the marriage's collapse followed Malkovich for years. Headley went on to build a solid career of her own, memorable especially for her work in comedies like Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, before her death in 2017. Horton continued working steadily in television. Neither of them, as far as the public record shows, ever gave a detailed public account of what happened. For over 3 decades, that's essentially where the story sat. 2 marriages that ended at the same time, in connection with the same film, with a director on record calling it what it was, and 2 lead actors who simply never discussed it. Malkovich occasionally offered a stray, deflecting line when journalists brought it up. In a 2008 conversation with Rolling Stone, he expressed something close to disbelief that Pfeiffer had ever paid him any attention at all, brushing off the subject almost as quickly as he raised it. It was charming, evasive, and told you almost nothing. Pfeiffer, for her part, said nothing whatsoever. Not a denial, not a deflection, not even the vague non-answer that celebrities usually reach for when a reporter asks about old rumors. Just silence, sustained for decades, through countless interviews where the subject surely could have come up and never did. That silence is what makes what happened in 2025 so notable. Malkovich appeared on the podcast Fashion Neurosis, hosted by Bella Freud, and roughly 25 minutes into the conversation, the subject of Pfeiffer came up. And for the first time in almost 40 years, he didn't deflect. He acknowledged that this was a topic he essentially never discussed. He talked about how quickly actors can form intense emotional connections while working closely together, describing it as simply part of the job, and noted that only rarely does that kind of bond extend past the work itself. It's a careful, almost clinical way of describing what by every other account was a serious romantic relationship that ended 2 marriages, but it was also, notably, the first time he'd said anything on the subject at all instead of laughing it off. What he said next is the part worth paying close attention to, because it wasn't an admission framed around romance or heartbreak, it was framed entirely around loss of a different kind. He described Pfeiffer as someone he valued enormously as a colleague, someone genuinely fun to work with and, in her dealings with him, remarkably fair. Then he added, a little ruefully, that he himself hadn't been nearly as fair in return. And then came the line that's been quoted everywhere since. His observation that when a working relationship crosses over into something more than collegial, even into a profound friendship, you end up losing something rarer than romance, you lose a great colleague. Sit with that phrasing for a second, because it's doing something unusual. Malkovich isn't denying that anything happened. He isn't offering the standard celebrity dodge of, we were just close friends, or, people love to speculate. He's not even really talking about the affair itself in any explicit sense. What he's mourning, in his own roundabout way, is the professional relationship he lost as a side effect of the personal one. That is a strange kind of regret to lead with, if you think about it. Most people, looking back on an affair that ended 2 marriages, would talk about guilt, or love, or heartbreak, or at least offer some kind of moral accounting. Malkovich, ever the actor's actor, chose instead to eulogize a colleague he says he wasn't good enough to keep. It's the kind of answer that tells you a great deal about how he processes things, without technically confirming any of the specific facts everyone already assumed were true. Because, make no mistake, the facts were already largely assumed to be true, well before 2025. This wasn't Malkovich breaking brand new information, it was Malkovich, for the first time, agreeing to actually engage with a topic he'd spent nearly 40 years declining to touch. The distinction matters. A story that had lived for decades in that gray zone between everybody in Hollywood believes this happened, and no one directly involved has ever said so, finally got a first-hand voice attached to it. Not a full account. Not a timeline. Just an acknowledgement, delivered with the kind of careful, faintly literary phrasing that Malkovich has built an entire public persona around. Now here's the detail that gets lost in a lot of the coverage, and it's worth being precise about. Michelle Pfeiffer did not say any of this. She has not, as of this recording, addressed the affair in any interview, podcast, documentary, or public statement. Every word we've just discussed belongs to Malkovich. Pfeiffer's contribution to this story remains exactly what it has been for over 30 years. Nothing. Total, consistent, apparently permanent silence. If you've seen headlines suggesting that Pfeiffer finally admitted to the affair, that's simply not accurate. What actually happened is that her former co-star talked, and the internet did what it always does with a juicy old rumor that suddenly has new fuel. It collapsed the distinction between someone connected to the story spoke and the person at the center of the story spoke. Why has Pfeiffer stayed quiet for this long, when the broad outline of the story has been public knowledge for decades. It's worth remembering who she is as a public figure. Pfeiffer has never been the type to overshare. She gives interviews, but selectively, and she's built a career-long reputation for keeping her actual personal life, as opposed to her carefully curated public one, largely off the table. She's spoken at length, when she chooses to, about topics like family and privacy and the pressures of fame, but she has drawn a hard and apparently permanent line around this particular chapter. Given that she's someone who has openly discussed difficult and vulnerable material from earlier in her life, including a controlling group she has said she was entangled with early in her career, something she has credited her first husband with helping her get out of, her silence here doesn't read as an inability to talk about hard things. It reads as a deliberate choice about this specific subject. That distinction matters more than it might seem. Plenty of celebrities avoid certain topics simply because they're private people in general, uncomfortable with any kind of personal disclosure. Pfeiffer doesn't fit that pattern. She's given thoughtful, sometimes surprisingly candid interviews across her career, touching on insecurity, on the strange psychological toll of fame arriving all at once in her 20s, on the specific difficulty of raising children while working in an industry built on public exposure. She's shown, repeatedly, that she's capable of opening up when she decides a subject is worth discussing. Which makes the total silence on this one subject feel less like general reticence and more like a boundary she has consciously chosen never to cross, no matter how many decades pass or how many times the story resurfaces. And there's something almost fitting about that choice, given the film that started all of this. Dangerous Liaisons is, after all, a story about people who talk entirely too much, who write letters, make confessions, brag about their conquests, and ultimately destroy each other through the sheer volume of what they choose to reveal. Pfeiffer playing the one character in that story defined by restraint, and then living out something like the real-world equivalent of restraint for the following 30-plus years, has an almost poetic symmetry to it that's hard to ignore. As for what happened after 1988, both of their lives moved in very different directions from the tabloid storm that briefly surrounded them. Pfeiffer married television producer David E. Kelley in 1993, and the two have remained together for more than 3 decades, raising 2 children largely out of the public eye. Professionally, the years right after Dangerous Liaisons turned out to be some of the richest of her career. The Fabulous Baker Boys brought her a Golden Globe and an Oscar nomination, and her turn as Catwoman in Batman Returns became one of the most iconic performances of the decade. She's continued working consistently ever since, including more recent, higher-profile roles in the Marvel films. Malkovich, for his part, moved into a long-term relationship with Nicoletta Perron, with whom he has 2 children, and has spoken about building a life largely based in Europe, somewhat removed from the Hollywood machine that once defined him. His career since Dangerous Liaisons has been almost aggressively eclectic, from the Oscar-nominated tension of In the Line of Fire to the surreal self-portrait of being John Malkovich, a film literally built around the strangeness of being him, to an ongoing run of international and stage work that resists easy categorization. He's remained, across 4 decades, one of the more unpredictable and reliably interesting actors working.